The famous last words of Jesus in the manuscripts of our earliest gospel are the haunting cry from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Four so-called Western witnesses, however, record a different verb, ὠνείδισας in Greek, represented as maledixisti, exprobrasti, or in opprobrium dedisti in Latin. The question becomes, why has God reviled, slandered, reproached, or taunted the dying Jesus? Regardless if one thinks that is or isn't the earliest reading of this verse, the wording is a true enigma. Why would anyone, whether the initial author or a later copyist, seem to botch an otherwise clear quotation from the opening of Psalm 22, especially since aspects of that specific psalm shape the very wording of Mark's Passion narrative? It seems difficult to explain why an author would do so, but also difficult to explain why a later copyist would do so. The external evidence. We have 5 witnesses for ὠνείδισας. In the reading is found only in manuscripts of Mark, not in the parallel in Matthew. Codex Beza, at least the Greek side, reads ὠνείδισας, but the Latin side has dereliquisti, forsaken, which is the standard reading found in Vulgate manuscripts. Codex Babiensis from the 4th century initially evidently read maledixisti, but a later corrector changed it to dereliquisti. It's hard to see in this image right there. Codex Colbertinus, a medieval manuscript with pre-Vulgate text from the 12th century, reads exprobrasti. Codex Vindobonensis from the late 5th or early 6th century reads in opprobrium dedisti. It has pre-Vulgate text as well. And then also the Apokritikos of Macarius, 4th or 5th century, possibly quoting Porphyry or Hierocles, reads ὠνείδισας, and I'll discuss that further in just a second. Unfortunately, Codex W has a large lacuna here, nor is P45 extant. The rest of the manuscript tradition, including the Vetus Latina manuscripts, record the traditional reading forsaken. Opinions on the variant reading. The reading ὠνείδισας has rarely been given much consideration. F.C. Burkitt in 1900 was the Cambridge scholar who discovered the underlying reading maledixisti in Babiensis, and he is the earliest on record to favor the reading ὠνείδισας. Harnack thought ὠνείδισας was so inexplicable that it must be the earliest reading. He then explained ὠνείδισας as a reference to the reproach of Christ in Hebrews 11 and 13, which he thought had reached the status of a technical term. But Harnack's view on this gained little traction. C.H. Turner, 1927, who liked Western readings, favored ὠνείδισας because, quote, "it is quite impossible that any scribe should have invented this reading." After these, clicked in the wrong spot. After these early advocates, ὠνείδισας has generally been treated as just another anomaly of the text of Beza or the Old Latin tradition. Some, such as Metzger, simply suggest that the reading arose to avoid the difficulty that God had forsaken Jesus on the cross. In 1993, Bart Ehrman, in his groundbreaking work, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, explained the reading as an intentional change by a proto-Orthodox scribe to keep ἐγκατέλιπές from being used as a proof text by the Separationist. The Separationists, as Ehrman explains, are the ones attacked by Irenaeus, who thought the Spirit of the Christ came down upon the man Jesus at his baptism and left him with the cry of dereliction before his death. Ehrman's volume, now in its 2nd edition, has gone on to become a tour de force in the field, regardless if one agrees with his interpretation of specific variants or not. With this particular variant, Ehrman's influence is unmistakable. He seems to have provided the answer to this otherwise inexplicable reading. Since 1993, most major commentaries on Mark either acknowledge or agree with Ehrman's assessment of this variant, except for Peter Rodgers, whose theory I'll address shortly. And by the way, thank you, Peter, for joining us today. I have appreciated corresponding with you. But Ehrman has left questions unanswered. If a proto-Orthodox scribe wanted to safeguard doctrine against perceived heresy, why change a manuscript to do so? I mean, he'd change it in my manuscript, but not for yours. And we can tell from the comments from Irenaeus that there were already multiple copies of New Testament books such as Revelation circulating at that time. And also, why change only Mark? Matthew would have been circulating and more widely and more popularly than Mark, and it too has the same cry of dereliction, and there's no evidence that any textual editing was ever done to Matthew at this point. And also, why would a later scribe disharmonize such a significant, noteworthy statement in a way that puts it at odds with both Matthew and the book of Psalms? A scribe would be creating more problems than he solves. So let's talk about these two questions. First, why only Mark? When you read Ehrman's chapter on the Separationist, he summarizes how we know, primarily from Irenaeus and later Hippolytus, about early Christians such as Cerinthus, who thought Jesus was not born of a virgin, but instead was the natural-born son of Joseph and Mary, and that at his baptism, the Spirit of Christ came down upon him, but at the end, the same Spirit separated from him so that the man Jesus suffered, died, and rose again. Prima facie, Mark would seem to be the ideal book and favorite gospel for the Separationist. Since Mark has no mention of a miraculous birth, Mark mentions the Spirit descending at his baptism. The cry of dereliction of Mark can be read as the point of separation at the end. Irenaeus seems to add additional evidence for the Separationist use of Mark in Against Heresies 3.11.7. There he describes how each of the four Gospels was subjected to heresy by its independent use apart from the other three. Irenaeus attributes error to the Ebionites for only using Matthew, Marcionites for Luke, Separationists for Mark, Valentinians for John. Sounds like a slam dunk explanation supporting Ehrman's theory that ὠνείδισας was an attempt to thwart separationists from using and abusing Mark specifically, since it doesn't sound like they would have found Matthew as helpful. But not so fast. We actually have primary materials from antiquity which seems to express separationist theology, where the separationist only using Mark like Irenaeus implies. Consider first the Achaemenid fragment, P. Cairo 10.759. The Achaemenid fragment is an 8th or 9th century parchment fragment containing part of a text in Greek that is commonly called the Gospel of Peter from the 2nd century. Twice it makes autobiographical first-person references to Peter. The extant portions describe things pertaining to the trial, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. It appears to be a separationist kind of text because the only statement from the cross is a noticeable alteration of the cry of dereliction. My power, O power, you have left me. Instead of addressing God for not intervening, this portraying Jesus decries losing his divine power in essence before he dies. Now, based on the comments of Irenaeus, we should expect such a text to be based more on Mark than Matthew or the other Gospels. But from the extant text, we can tell it's actually heavily based on Matthew, or at least Matthew-like traditions. The initial statement in the extant text is an allusion to Pilate washing his hands, known only from Matthew 27. Also, it mentions the whole earth shook at Jesus' death, an event mentioned only in Matthew 27. Two heavenly intruders are quite reminiscent of the angel of the Lord in Matthew 28. And then furthermore, most of the Gospel of Peter concerns itself with Roman guards being stationed at Jesus' tomb. Again, a storyline found only in Matthew, not Mark, Luke, or John. Thus, it's safe to say that the Achaemenid fragment was, with explicit separationist thinking, was also clearly utilizing Matthew, or at least Matthew-like traditions, certainly not Mark alone. So the Gospel of Peter. Also consider Nag Hammadi Codex 2, Tractate 3, more commonly but misleadingly called the Gospel of Philip. The Gospel of Philip is the third work in a 4th century papyrus codex which contains text in Coptic of an otherwise unknown gospel from the 2nd or 3rd century. The Gospel of Philip is Exhibit A for the separationist usage of the cry of dereliction. Verse 72, quoting Schenke's translation, states, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Lord spoke these words on the cross, for there he was separated. Well, there you go. It doesn't get much more straightforward than that. The cry of dereliction is quoted, and the text of the Gospel of Philip states, for there he was separated, end of quote. Knowing what Irenaeus said about the separationist and their preference for Mark, one would naturally assume Gospel of Philip has got to be quoting Mark, not Matthew, for the cry of dereliction. But not so fast. Is the Gospel of Philip familiar with the Gospel of Matthew? Well, actually, yes, it's very dependent on Matthew, or at least Matthew-like traditions. Too many examples to cite, but here's just a few. Gospel of Philip mentions Christ was born of a virgin. That's certainly not Mark, possibly Matthew or Luke. Gospel of Philip quotes verbatim from Matthew 6:6, which has no parallels in Mark, Luke, or John. Gospel of Philip also quotes verbatim from Matthew 15:13 with no parallels to Mark, Luke, or John. Gospel of Philip mentions the outer darkness, a phrase 3 times in Matthew, never in Mark, Luke, or John. It also 5 times expresses kingdom of heaven as a phrase. In fact, the only time it ever mentions kingdom of God is in a verbatim quote in which Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 15. And of course, kingdom of heaven is Matthean language. Also at the baptism, there's mention of fulfill all righteousness, which is Matthew's version of the baptism. I can go on, but I think you get the point. Clearly, Gospel of Philip has separationist ideas of the cry of dereliction, but it is utilizing not just Mark, as one would expect, it's also utilizing Matthew. And Matthew is actually the gospel that is utilized the most. So now back to my question for Ehrman and his theory. If the reading ὠνείδισας originated as a late attempt by a proto-Orthodox scribe to thwart the spread of separationism, why only make this change to Mark? Why not also in Matthew? Matthew was more popular, and the cry of dereliction was being utilized by the non-Orthodox, while they also used other passages from Matthew. Why make an Orthodox corruption only in Mark if that was the motivation behind this reading? So question number 2, why disharmonize a text? According to Ehrman, a proto-Orthodox scribe replaced ἐγκατέλιπές with ὠνείδισας to thwart the spread of separationism. But why would a scribe knowingly create a reading that sits at odds not just with Matthew, but also the book of Psalms? Such a change would create a double disharmony of the text. We know from the manuscript tradition that differences between the Gospels were the source of frustration for various readers and copyists, because it's not uncommon to find textual variants that involve harmonization, ironing out the wrinkles when the Gospels are compared side by side, or simply even when the wording was recalled by memory. The scribal tendency was almost always towards harmonization and not away from it. Harmonization was such a major concern that whole books were written to harmonize things, most famously Tatian's Diatessaron, but also Justin's prior to that, the Gospel of the Ebionites and others, not to mention the extensive work of Augustine and others to explain differences between the Gospels. Differences and disharmony between the Gospels were not just a source of frustration for Christians. Differences became the fodder for the attacks by pagan critics. In fact, this very text, the cry of dereliction, was explicitly cited as a contradiction between the Gospels by one pagan critic, as he ridiculed Christians for believing in something that was false and fabricated. The unnamed critic was possibly Porphyry or Hierocles, but we don't know his identity for certain. What we do know is that a document known as the Apokritikos records a dialogue in which a Christian named Macarius responds to a pagan critic called the Hellene, probably around the year 400. This text was discovered in 1867 and published in 1876. The pagan critic lambasts Christians for having 4 documents that claim 4 different statements from Jesus as his last words. From Luke, I will commend my spirit. From John, it is finished. From Matthew, why have you forsaken me? And we find the Western text of Mark, my God, why have you reviled me? This pagan critic uses the very difference between Matthew and the Western text of Mark as one of his main examples of an irreconcilable contradiction, which begs the question, if a proto-Orthodox scribe was trying to thwart the spread of separationism, why would he create more problems than he solves by disharmonizing a text, and doubly so against both Matthew and Psalms? Why create a reason for ridicule in the eyes of your critics? And what is especially noteworthy in the Apokritikos is that at another point in the religious debate, Macarius the Christian corrects the pagan Hellene's quotation of John 12:31. The Hellene quotes a version of the verse known in Codex Beza, and Macarius goes on to say, or as it is written in some copies. Macarius is well aware of textual differences that today we see when we compare Vaticanus and Beza, and yet with Mark 15, the cry of dereliction, Macarius does not correct the Hellene as if ὠνείδισας is a textual variant in Mark 15. In other words, it's assumed to be the text, not a variant reading. If Ehrman's theory is sustainable for Mark 15, I ask 2 important questions. Why change only Mark, and why disharmonize a significant gospel parallel? So what alternative is there to Ehrman's theory? I will suggest that ὠνείδισας is the earliest reading of Mark 15, but from reasons different from those of Harnack. I think Harnack was correct that ὠνείδισας is so unusual that it's quite unlikely that a later scribe would have any determinative reason to make such a change. Instead, I think the author intended to read ὠνείδισας, and the reason it rarely shows up in the manuscript tradition is because early on, Matthew harmonized it to Psalms, and scribes early on copying Mark overwhelmingly harmonized Mark 15 to match both Psalms and Matthew. Now, the tough question remains. Why would the author knowingly amalgamate a quote of Psalm 22? That the cry of dereliction is a quote of Psalm 22 is unquestioned. It's the only place in the entire Greek Bible where God is addressed duplicatively as my God, and the rest of the wording matches as well. So no other passage remotely comes close, and the statement is important in the Mark and Passion narrative since Psalm 22 is utilized for the wording and imagery as indirect scriptural fulfillment. So why would the author not do a better job quoting Psalm 22? Well, in 2011, Peter Rodgers published a little paperback book on several textual variants entitled Text and Story. He devotes a whole chapter to this variant, and I found his theory on this quite compelling. Rodgers demonstrates that throughout the Gospel of Mark, the author has a noticeable tendency to combine Old Testament passages into what he calls composite echoes. And I could give many examples. I would encourage you to read his chapter, but here's a few noteworthy ones. The opening quote in Mark chapter 1 is famously a combined quote of both Malachi and Isaiah 40. The statement at the baptism is a combo quote of Psalm 2, Isaiah 42, and possibly Genesis 22. And I've color-coded these so you can spot the combinations. The statement of Jesus at the temple cleansing is a combo quote of both Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7. Jesus' statement to the high priest is a combination of Daniel 7 and Psalm 110. And then privately corresponding with Peter Rodgers, we talked about how Western readings tend to have this composite effect. So that in Mark 12, the Western text incorporates the preposition from Psalm 8 into a quotation of Psalm 110. Or I added in how in Mark 13, the ending of verse 2 is a combination of quotes from Daniel 2 and Daniel 9. But that brings us to the Western text of Mark 15. So it's actually, as Peter Rodgers demonstrates, it's actually characteristic of the author's style to have a combination of two or more Old Testament quotes melded together. And Rodgers argues that ὠνείδισας is from Psalm 69 and has been inserted into Psalm 22. And without repeating all that he shows, I'll simply say that yes, verse 9 was formative in early Christian thinking, and the repeated use of reproach in that psalm is where the Western reading of Mark 15 originates. And I find his theory to be quite persuasive. But if Rodgers is correct, we still have some unanswered questions. What about the Aramaic in verse 34? Why would the author record a Greek translation of a quote that doesn't seem to match the Aramaic he just previously cited? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Certainly the Aramaic in Mark 15 has plenty of textual fluctuation. There are oodles of variant spellings and readings on that, but none of the many readings and spellings remotely resemble the concept of reproached or revile in Aramaic. In fact, if you're curious about that, Eberhard Nestle did a lot of studies on that the turn of the last century, but none of those theories were found persuasive. Why would the author seem to imply forsake with the Aramaic, yet record revile in the Greek translation? Harnack argued that the evangelist knew the meaning of sabachthani, but deliberately chose to relieve the harshness of forsaken, and so chose to paraphrase sabachthani as reviled. Twice earlier in Mark, the author offers words in Aramaic that don't literally match his Greek translation. Mark 3, sons of thunder, does not really resemble Boanerges. Mark 5, we have a phrase in the middle, little girl, I say to you, arise, a paraphrase of Talitha Kumi. So elsewhere, the author paraphrases Aramaic into Greek, and possibly here as well at the crucifixion. Question 2, why would the author feel the need to avoid the word ἐγκατέλιπές by inserting ὠνείδισας in its place? Possibly the author felt ἐγκατέλιπές was too problematic, because it can be misunderstood to contradict another famous statement from the Psalms that was utilized by early Christians. Psalm 16 verse 10 states, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor will you give your body to see, nor will you give your Holy One to see corruption." This psalm was already utilized in the first century as a proof text for Jesus' resurrection. Twice in Acts, this verse is cited as scriptural basis, Peter in Acts 2, Paul in Acts 13. And it's interesting to note that these citations occur in Acts, which is the sequel to Luke, which is based on Mark, and Luke omits Mark's cry of dereliction. So long before the Separationist arose in the 2nd century, already in the 1st century, the verb ἐγκατέλιπες would be problematic in the cry of dereliction because it would appear to contradict the promise in Psalm 16 that God would not abandon the Messiah's soul. Furthermore, the problem of ἐγκατέλιπες is also found in 2nd Maccabees. Now, Mark makes no clear direct usage of 2nd Mac, but the theme of martyrdom is found noticeably in both books. 2nd Maccabees functions as a Jewish martyrology in which 7 brothers, their mother, a pious scribe, all choose death rather than breaking their covenant with Yahweh. And significantly, 3 times we find in the text of 2nd Mac assurances that God would not abandon his people in the face of martyrdom. Unlike Daniel in the lion's den or the 3 Jewish youths in the fiery furnace, these 9 pious Jews in 2nd Maccabees were not rescued from the brink of death. Instead, they all suffered and died as martyrs, not unlike the Markan Jesus. But 2nd Maccabees assures that these martyrs were not forsaken, and the cry of dereliction using ἐγκατέλιπές sounds like Jesus was. So long before the Separationist of the 2nd century, a quote of Psalm 22 utilizing ἐγκατέλιπές would be problematic in the 1st century, since it sounds contradictory to Psalm 16 and the thought that God does not abandon his martyrs. So because the author has a noticeable tendency to combine Old Testament passages, and because the verb ἐγκατέλιπες could be understood as problematic, the author of Mark would have chosen ὠνείδισας to connect Psalm 69 verse 9, the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. Exegesis. Now, if my arguments are found valid, the choice of ὠνείδισας must make sense in the context, and I think it does. How then would we understand this passage? Well, it's hard to overstate the importance of the cry of dereliction in Mark. This is the climactic statement of Jesus for the whole book. These words are literally Jesus's famous last words in the Gospel of Mark. He never speaks again in the narrative. And there are one of only 2 verbalized prayers of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, the other being a prayer request to avoid this very moment while he was in Gethsemane. And I suggest that is the key for understanding ὠνείδισας. Mark records only 2 prayers of Jesus, one at Gethsemane, one at Golgotha. There in Gethsemane, the Markan Jesus had addressed God in prayer, Abba, Father. And now at Golgotha, the Markan Jesus also uses a double vocative, my God, my God. At Gethsemane, the Markan Jesus used Aramaic and Greek words, and here at Golgotha, we also find words in Aramaic and Greek. At Gethsemane, the Markan Jesus used the active voice to directly request, remove this cup from me. But now at Golgotha, that bold request has been denied. I often wonder if we don't catch how shocking this is because we are too familiar with the story and already anticipate what will happen. But Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane is denied and rejected. This is especially acute in Mark because 4 chapters earlier, Jesus had himself declared to his disciples regarding prayer and answers, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Estai auto. Because of this, I say to you, all things whatsoever, pantahasa, you pray and ask, believe that you have received, and it will be done for you, estai humin. To his disciples, the Markan Jesus had declared with boldness that request in prayer without doubting would certainly happen. But now at Golgotha, his request has been denied, and his hope has been rejected. The cup was not removed. Why have you reviled me and my request? Jesus is not abandoned at Golgotha, even though his request at Gethsemane was denied. He looks abandoned by everyone and everything, but he really isn't. He's raised from the dead in the last scene. But he does die alone and rejected and reviled, and his request was denied and the cup was not removed. Conclusions. The earliest reading, the initial reading of Mark 15:34 was ὠνείδισας. It is unlikely that a proto-Orthodox scribe changed ἐγκατέλιπές, forsaken, to ὠνείδισας, reviled, because why change only Mark and not also the parallel in Matthew? And also, why disharmonize Mark against both Matthew 27 and Psalm 22? Third, the verb ἐγκατέλιπές was problematic in the first century. ἐγκατέλιπές seems to contradict Psalm 16. And the second Maccabees repeatedly shows that God does not abandon his martyrs. Fourth, combining words of two Septuagint passages is characteristic of the author of Mark. The author chose ὠνείδισας to express the agony that Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane was not granted at Golgotha. Early on, Matthew changed Mark's wording to ἐγκατέλιπές to match Psalm 22. And early on, scribes changed ὠνείδισας to ἐγκατέλιπές in Mark 15 to harmonize to both Matthew 27 and Psalm 22. And that's why rarely does this reading show up in the manuscript tradition. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Jeff. So applause for you there, and I will mute everyone again in the anticipation of some questions.
Sure, thank you, Hugh. I'll let my conclusions stand on the screen there, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Thank you. Well, there's lots of different steps that you've taken during the course of this.
When I distribute that, and I have a handout, if you didn't receive that in advance, I didn't include my conclusions on there. I didn't want to give away the end of the paper in advance. So if you want to take a screenshot or whatever, that's fine.
Okay, Peter has indicated that he will be first up. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Jeff. I wonder what you see the role of Romans 15 and this being quoted as something Jesus says as his giving himself up.
Romans 15, which specific verse?
Oh, it's about verse 3.
Oh.
Can't remember.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Psalm 69 verse 9 is quoted there in verse 3, Romans 15.
How does that factor in your discussion?
Well, it shows that early on that this the idea of reproach is very present, even with Paul from in the 50s. I also didn't have time in my paper. I find it interesting that the idea of reproach is also found in Daniel, and 5 times the noun form of reproach is found in Daniel. And Daniel is important background. In fact, I actually think it's the most significant background for the Gospel of Mark, even more important than Isaiah. Yeah, these ideas are there.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions, observations? Joey, I see hand up. Yep.
I guess like one observation that I thought was kind of fascinating about this variant is that it doesn't exactly concern what Jesus said, because I think both Matthew and Mark are clear that he spoke in Aramaic and they have the same word there, but it's what the author of the gospel understood what he said to mean.
Yes. And I think that, I think that's important. I think Mark is almost interpolating how he understood the Aramaic there, almost like the Targums do, the Aramaic Targums do of passages in Hebrew. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mark's trying to explicitly express how he understands what's going on there. I think Mark's trying to avoid the notion forsaken there. Yeah. He's kind of sidestepping it.
Interesting.
Super, thanks. Jan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I like that very much. And it's a splendid exercise in Lectio Difficilio, actually, I think. However, I also think that we should not attribute to intentions good or bad, what can be attributed to error or stupidity. So maybe in this case, if I look at verse 32, maybe you addressed it, but and look a bit further. There, the verb, of course, ὠνείδισον occurs. So, and that has something negative on it. So can the reading in Codex Basic simply be a repetition of that verb through scribal error, like by association or something?
Yeah, and Harnack actually thinks that the author is playing off of that verb in verse 32, and that's why he's expressing it in verse 34. So instead of seeing a later scribe being influenced by verse 32, Harnack, for example, thought the author was extending the usage there.
Yeah, but could this influence of verse 32 not be at the scribal level?
Yeah, it could be. You know, there's another interesting variant similar to that, where you have a connection. The word toma, the word for corpse, occurs in Mark 15. I don't remember the verses offhand. And there's actually a variant in babiensis again that repeats its usage, even though the earlier usage is not found there. So yeah, to what effect do we, when we have, I forget which verses that's in, maybe 43 and 45, I believe, off the top of my head. So yeah, sometimes, is it a scribe being influenced by a usage just 2 verses earlier, or is the author trying to extend that usage? That's the debated point.
Well, at least the possibility should be mentioned. I don't think I'm right all the time, but maybe I do have some idea.
Thank you. I hope to publish this, and there is more I need to include, but limited on time here.
Thank you. I think perhaps our final formal question will be the other Jeff.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Jeff, for that. That's a splendid analysis, and it's lovely to see a specific text dealt with in such detail rather than just overview and generality. I have a quick observation and then a question.
Okay.
So I thought, I actually looked it up in ἐγκατέλιπες because I thought to myself, well, Mark's writing a fairly simple Greek, and this doesn't look like a simple verb. It's certainly not a simplex. He might be more inclined to use a simple verb. And what's this verb mean anyway? When I looked it up, I was struck by how few occurrences there are in LSJ, just give a few, and they gloss it by to leave in the lurch, and in fact cite Matthew, which I thought was rather intriguing, but leave that aside, because then I went to Hatch and Redpath and I saw that there's 3 columns of this verb. It's everywhere in the Septuagint, very common. So that rather underlined my observation, so I was going to withdraw it. In the meantime, I wondered what you make, this is my question now, I wonder what you make of the word order and the seemingly strange pre-placement of me. And I noticed that the Latin divides. Sometimes the Latin supports me before and sometimes me afterwards. But that word order in Matthew seemed to me odd.
Yeah, and there is slight difference in word order in Matthew, and we also see fluctuation, and even on the part about my God, whether the pronoun mu is included or not. And technically in the Septuagint of the Psalm 20, it's verse 21, verse 2 in Psalms, there's actually an additional phrase there, attend to me, that's not mentioned by either gospel writer. So we do see fluctuation there. It doesn't look like that either gospel writer, Mark or Matthew, was actually looking at the manuscript of Psalms in Greek to record this. And so we do see some fluctuation there. Yeah. I don't know if that's, yeah.
But don't look at me, Hugh. I don't know the answer. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, well, I think we just see fluctuation. I think some of it is with the scribes trying to harmonize more literally, and I think that strengthens my point. They were concerned about harmonization. And so, yeah, if Mark originally wrote ὠνείδισας, there would be, just early on, there would be that tendency to harmonize it with Psalm 22, not to mention Matthew, which was so well known popularly. Yeah. One of the interesting things I find is that, Irenaeus is the earliest, Irenaeus is the earliest person that we have extant to discuss a textual variant. His discussion of the number of the beast, 666, is the earliest known textual variant to be discussed within 100 years of the writing of Revelation. And when he discussed that, he actually mentions copies, plural, that have 616 and copies, plural, that have 666. He knows at least 4, if not more, copies of the Apocalypse, which didn't even circulate widely within 100 years. And that's kind of my point I was saying earlier about if an Orthodox scribe is trying to safeguard the text by making a change, well, it changes it for my manuscript, but not all these others that are circulating. And it doesn't change it in Matthew. And it seems like it would have little effect if that was, if that's what the attempt was doing. I will say this also. I find it more compelling when we have a Western reading in Mark in which we have unanimity of the Western witnesses. For example, Mark 13:2, the longer ending of that verse, every single Western witness attests that. There's 13 witnesses. Here with this one, ὠνείδισας, we've only got 4 manuscripts and then also the Apokritikos. But I think that maybe that's early on. It's not a variant that's only in Babiensis, and Babiensis has plenty of peculiar variants. In fact, in this very verse, Helion, and then Beza has plenty of unique variants. But when we have multiple Western witnesses, I think it needs to be taken significantly. The Western text, as Westcott and Hort argue, was the most widely distributed text of the earliest times. It's not merely in the West that it's being used. In fact, our most famous Western witness, Beza, Professor Parker believes comes from Beirut, which is in the East. And those Western readings can be traced back to the 2nd century. And Babiensis, many people have shown that has close affinity with Cyprian, mid-3rd century church father. So even though we have only 4 witnesses here, it's more than just a rogue or a unique reading in a rogue manuscript.
Thanks. Well, I think at that point I shall close the formal proceedings here, and we'll thank you. But we can always stay in the room for a bit longer to talk more about the Western text,
Sure.
if that's desired.